Okay. Hi guys, we are group 2 and today we'll be talking about ranching on public lands in Arizona. I'm Elizabeth Quigley.
I'm Riley Arnold.
I'm Cassandra Prusky.
And I'm Addie Hegde.
So to get started, what is ranching on public lands? In the United States, there is a lot of land owned by state governments as well as the federal government, and this land can be used to lease out to the public for public use, and one of the common uses is grazing for livestock. So in Arizona, the vast majority of land is owned by the state or federal government, and the majority of the land use that the government leases out to for private use is for public ranching and grazing for livestock. So there's a large economy and a large population of ranchers in Arizona that use public lands for ranching and livestock grazing.
So to further talk about some of those statistics regarding land, only 18.2% of Arizona land is private land, and the federal government already controls more than 30 million acres of land in our state, and then more than 635 million throughout the entire country.
So what's the big deal? Why is this really important that we manage this right now? So public land ranching affects the surrounding habitat, such as biodiversity, and biodiversity of plants and animals affects the land's ecosystem, and the land's ecosystem affects how the land is able to regenerate. It also affects cleanliness of waterways. Natural irrigation is very helpful because the water is already filtered through the surrounding plants, and it also affects future generation land use because healthy land kind of equals healthy animals, which equals healthy us. So future generations can continue to use the land if it's managed properly and healthy.
So in terms of some previous policies that have been implemented, there was the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, and the Taylor Grazing Act created the first grazing districts, which were intended to prevent public rangelands from becoming like too overgrazed or anything. And then there's the Public Rangelands Improvement Act of 1978, and this act was to implement standard federal fees for animal unit months. It was also established to incentivize responsible land management. However, there's been little enforcement of it and little impact of this particular policy overall.
So what are the challenges with public ranching? There are many environmental issues to start. As we will talk about later with the Endangered Species Act, there are many native and protected species in Arizona that are negatively impacted by grazing on public lands, whether they're plant species or animal species. The cattle or the general livestock grazing on these lands can ruin their habitats, can take away their food sources, and ultimately lead to the extinction of some species. Additionally, there is a large issue with pollution. Runoff from these ranches can pollute waterways, and that can get into crops and ruin agriculture, and there's a risk to human and animal health. There's also overexploitation of the lands, as a lot of these ranchers will not monitor how much their livestock are over-consuming or over-exploiting the land, which can lead to desertification, which we already don't need more of in Arizona. There are additionally economic challenges. Because the animal unit per month costs are below market value, the Bureau of Land Management is not bringing in profit. So due to that, there is little money to invest in the land in order to protect it and regenerate the plant species and biodiversity that's being taken away by the livestock grazing. Following the economic challenges, there are additionally management issues due to having little economic ability for having staff on hand to regulate the use of livestock grazing on the public lands. There's little incentive for ranchers to treat the lands in a way that is sustainable and does not lead to overexploitation. And there's additionally with this regulation a lack of accountability systems and people to hold ranchers accountable for treating this land with respect. There are also finally significant knowledge gaps when it comes to ranching on public lands. There is a disconnect between understanding regenerative practices on these public lands with livestock grazing in order to create a sustainable circular system. And therefore, a lot of the practices currently being used are harmful for the lands and lead to their degradation. And communication gaps between different groups, whether they're ranchers, whether they're environmentalists, whether they're people who have been having these circular systems with livestock grazing for a long time, those communication gaps are significant and have presented challenges for having a sustainable ranching system in Arizona.
To go over the key stakeholders, the BLM is a big one. They manage the grazing land. The ranchers use the land for meat production. Environmentalists want the habitat to be regenerated. Fish and Wildlife Services enforce the Endangered Species Act, and the EPA enforces the Clean Air and Water Act. And for recommendations, there are financial incentives. So incentives for farmers to it'll basically decrease or increase fees depending on how well the farmers are able to meet those regulations. And it also helps the environmentalists feel more at ease because the guidelines are actually being enforced somehow. Instead of just being kind of like a loose idea of what you should be doing, but there's no real accountability. And also ranchers will be leading more sustainable practices. Another important part, I think, in getting ranchers to feel and getting everyone to feel more connected to the issue and to the solution is collaborative communication. So this can be done through like management, like the Upper River Verde Management Program is a great example of this, of the cooperative management between ranchers and scientists. So they work together to study the effects grazing has on the surrounding habitat by slowly introducing cattle to the area, by monitoring the fish populations in a nearby river. And I think this is just an awesome example of this type of collaborative communication. And this also helps share knowledge between the ranchers and government and scientists that are involved. It also creates a sense of mutual trust. So, and this in turn allows the BLM and EPA to kind of have more supervision as well.
Stronger regulations is also another big recommendation. For example, in the general guidelines for Arizona, at least, it doesn't really specify, although more specific than the overall guidelines, it doesn't really specify, or guys, I'm sorry. Oh, we were so close. I'm so sorry.
You're all good.
Keep going, we'll just piece it together.
Okay. For stronger regulations, the guidelines for Arizona needs to be more specific. It doesn't include Arizona's land type or the climate it has. It also doesn't specify how, okay. Stronger regulations is another big recommendation. For example, Arizona guidelines and regulations aren't very specific to Arizona's climate and land type. It also doesn't specify when land officers who go to land and kind of check off the list for the guidelines, it doesn't acknowledge what they would do with those, or if ranchers do not meet guidelines, it doesn't specify what the consequences or actions would be to take after. Regulations also for Endangered Species Act should be enforced more swiftly and seriously under under the guidance of a third-party review board, there should also be a specific period of time given to ranchers to allow them to remove their livestock from land if needed. So overall, if financial incentives are enforced, revenue will increase for BLM and they will be able to take stronger action for regulation and enforcement. And this slide just gives an idea of how much land is controlled by the government, and each section has a different organization by the government.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for listening today. We hope you learned a lot more about ranching on public lands in Arizona. So thank you, and here are our references.